Minister Alfonso Prat-Gay, Minister of Economy in Argentina. It's been a very long day. I know an even longer day for the Minister who's just off a long flight from Argentina. So I really appreciate you coming here this evening. We've heard a lot today about the problems of the world, the strains, all the things that have gone wrong. We had a long list of woes from Jacob Frankel at lunchtime, but it was striking to me that one name that was not on the list of woes was Argentina. In fact, Argentina was one of the very brightest spots in the early part of this year. I think it's really impressive how much progress the new government has made under President Mauricio Macri, in which Minister Prat-Gay is a prominent member. Progress towards unifying and floating the exchange rate, dismantling capital controls, slashing export taxes, making progress with holdout creditors. I know there's many challenges still ahead, but I think it's really impressive the speed and the decisiveness with which action has been taken. Minister Prat-Gay has a long and very distinguished record. Many of you will remember him as president of the Central Bank in Argentina, 2002 to 2004. In fact, he won a prize as the best central banker of the year from Euromoney for his record in bringing down inflation at that time. The minister has also worked in the financial sector. He worked at JP Morgan for a while. He worked in his own asset management company in Buenos Aires, which he founded. The minister will speak, give some initial remarks, and then he said he would be open to responding to a few questions. Minister, please.
Well, thank you, Charles. Good evening to everyone. I know you're exhausted. It's been a long day, so I thought I'll come over and sleep over with you guys and share my jet lag with you. Well, I was listening very carefully to the previous panel. I was in the speakers' room, and I thought it was very interesting. And I'm going to make a few remarks about that, but it's quite obvious that Argentina came up in the conversation all the time. And the question is whether Argentina is or is not a pattern for future debt restructuring procedures going forward. I think the whole idea of CACs, and to be fair, the whole idea of sovereign debt restructuring mechanisms, the famous SDRM that was put forth by Anne Krieger about 15 years ago, has actually come a long way. Lots of papers have been written since then. A few high-profile defaults have actually happened. And I celebrate the push that the G20 is putting behind these new bonds. I think this is obviously the way forward. I think both Lee and Sean in the previous panel have made significant contributions to the new generation of bonds, and we can be optimistic about the fact that in the future sovereign default and sovereign debt restructurings will be less traumatic than what they have been in the past if we move forward in this direction. As far as the discussion around liability management is concerned, my take on that one is that in as much as there is no price difference, as I think Sean was mentioning, I think at G20 and at the multilateral organizations, we should put our brains behind finding a way of accelerating this procedure going forward, and making sure that that outstanding $1 trillion worth of non-CAC bonds do turn into CAC bonds. And I think, in fact, Argentina is a very good case in point. One of the panelists was mentioning, well, even if it's, the same price, you need to pay some costs. Lawyers are always a problem, as you know. And then you need to go to the SEC and so forth. And then there's the moral hazard and the signaling problem. Well, take Argentina as an example. It has cost Argentina more than 2 million jobs. Not, putting this thing behind us for so many years. It puts you completely out of the picture. It puts you completely out of, the loop. It is incredibly costly to pay cash every time you have a maturity. And Argentina has made 55 billion of those cash payments over the last few years out of central bank reserves. And the flip side of that is that, we inherited pretty thin central bank reserves. So to the extent that you take Argentina as an example, the signaling issue should not be a problem, because what you should have in mind is if it goes wrong, it can go as wrong as it's been in this particular case. Nobody wants to let go 2 million jobs. 2 million jobs is around 12% of our workforce right now. So if signaling is a problem, even if the probability that you're signaling might be higher than what it actually is in terms of having a default, the expected loss that you could eventually have by getting into an Argentina type of negotiation is worth the effort. So I think that's the good news so far. And as I say, this administration, the Macri administration, will push forward for more CACs into the system, not because of us, but rather because of other countries that might need them going forward. However, the not so good news is that even with CACs and pari passu clauses and so forth, the holdout behavior can transform going forward and will continue to be shaped by experience. And this is where I'd like to share some of the issues that we've seen in a short period of time by trying to fix what the previous administration in Argentina decided not to fix for a number of years. Even with CACs, the incentives to hold out may remain material. Look at the past two big experiences. Argentina is one of them. The other one is the Greek experience, where holdouts actually succeeded in being paid in full at the time that the debt was being restructured. In the particular case of Argentina, holdouts succeeded in getting an injunction from the courts, not just for stopping Argentina from making payments to exchange bondholders, past bondholders, but actually future bondholders as well. So, their behavior, the holdout behavior, and the incentives for holdouts to be there need to be taken into account. They can mutate. They can be, holdouts of holdouts. They can be third or fourth generation of holdouts. CAC is a great idea, but I think we need to be alert and we need to be learning from the experience. And also the idea of the pari passu clause, which I'll get into this in a few minutes, but the irony of Argentina's case is that the pari passu clause is what forced the judge and the courts into the injunction, but it turns out that at the end of the day, intercreditor equality is not exactly what you get once you have a large set of bonds and when creditors are being allocated claims with very different values, which was the case of Argentina, and this is actually what made the solution so difficult. Don't be mistaken. We've made significant progress over the last 2 months, but it was not small feat. It wasn't easy. We had to spend a lot of time, and we had to spend a lot of conversations with different creditors who had different claims in the very same court, it's not just the contractual conditions on the bonds, it's also the legal framework that I believe we need to think about very thoroughly if we are really committed to pari passu or to intercreditor equity. Now, what are the lessons from, I think I'm doing well on time here, what are the lessons from our own experience? As I said before, we are trying to fix, we're only like 2.5 months in office, and we've done a lot more than the previous administration in 12 years or so in this particular department. There are a few issues to bear in mind here. Of course, the Argentina case has been long drawn out, extremely costly, particularly for Argentina, probably for some creditors, even if not for all of them. And the fact that we did not have the CACs is part of the problem. Of course, the other part of the problem was the behavior of the previous administration in Argentina and its own mistakes and its own faults, which was also mentioned in the previous panel. I'll pick 3 obvious mistakes that the sovereign made along the way since 2001 onwards. The first one was denial or self-denial, and this was quite obvious from the outset. Argentina restructured a big chunk of its debt in 2005. By then, 4 years had elapsed already since the default, and there were more than 42 lawsuits already sitting in the New York courts. So even if you were extremely optimistic about what you were about to do, chances that at least one of those 42 lawsuits would actually hit the fan were non-negligible. So the self-denial, the denial of the administration back then was obviously part of the problem. Second issue was the lock law. I think everyone in this room is aware of what the lock law means. It is squarely against the pari passu clauses, and this is why it became such a huge legal problem. And this is why eventually the courts judged against Argentina on that pari passu clause, and the injunction and the inability that Argentina still has to raise money in the international market has got a lot to do with the lock law. And then there was this particular strategy used by the previous government in Argentina. It was not just the lock law, there were a few other laws. But, this is something we need to spend some time on, because we all hope that in the upcoming cases, the next sovereign debtor will have a different strategy. But there might actually be, political incentives to do things similar to what the previous administration in Argentina has done. So my first reading there is that self-denial and political constraints are 2 elements of the debtor equation that will not simply go away just because you've got the CACs. So that's one for you guys to think about. And of course, the other side of the equation is that whenever the sovereign makes these amazing amount of mistakes, there's one party on the other side who can benefit hugely from that, from those mistakes, and this is obviously the holdout crew, which have made a lot of money out of Argentina's mistakes. Just one example there, I think Sean was mentioning the France. We had, France in the Argentine default, floating rate Argentina notes. These France had a very odd, structure embedded into them. Basically, they were floating not against LIBOR, but against Argentina's own country risk. The idea was that if Argentina was going through a rough time, its bond prices would fall, but there you would have protection because, if they fall, the coupon goes up, and therefore you're basically, protected through the bad times if you're an investor. I'm not so sure that was such a good idea, but it turned out to be an awful idea when you went to the courts, because these floating rate notes have been accruing interests throughout the default period, even if these bonds were basically non-trading. They were, in as much as they were trading once a week, they were trading at 25, 30 cents. The flip side of that was, yield to maturities that were very, very high, and therefore the holdouts were sitting in the courts accruing annual interest rates of, listen to this one, more than 100% per annum in some cases. I'll repeat that. The original principal amount on the Argentine francs, $294 million. The actual claim that is sitting in the New York courts right now, $3.1 billion. So, it takes a lawyer to make money more than, a financial advisor, it seems. But these are things that need to be taken into account when we talk about intercreditor equity. And not just intercreditor equity, but penalty interests going forward, because the defaults will happen and each legal system has its own rules for interest penalties that I believe need to be taken into account, because otherwise holdouts will be cherry-picking the right bond in the right jurisdiction with the right interest penalties, and that's also not necessarily good for the system as a whole. So I guess my thought there is that we need to think about contractual conditions for the bonds, but we might also need to spend some time looking into the actual legal frameworks. For instance, the penalty rates in the New York district, on top of some sort of extreme accrual interest rates, as I've just mentioned before, is in some cases 9%. 9% comes from the 80s, where interest rates were much, much higher in the US. There's not an obvious reason as to why you would charge 9% now with US interest rates close to zero. There's also a few other issues with the legal framework when you come to think about it. There are some creditors, talking about intercreditor equity, there are some creditors who were unlucky enough to get a sentence and to get a sentence in their favor too early in the process. And I'll emphasize that. They were unlucky to be proven right too early. And the reason why they were unlucky, because the earlier you were proven right, the lower the interest rate you were being priced with from a legal perspective. There were some holdouts that were trying not to get lucky. They were trying not to get the monetary sentence, because if they did not get the monetary sentence, they were able to keep accruing at interest rates that were 10 times more than what they would have if they were lucky. I don't know if you're following the irony, but I wish it was just an irony. That's exactly how it was. Finally, because I've got 9 minutes and I want a few questions from the audience, just a few lessons. There was some discussion about, may I get some water actually, please? There was some discussion about the GDP warrants and the GDP coupons. I think we need to be careful about getting too excited about financial innovations unless we are, very ready to be effective at implementing them. Argentina had their own GDP warrants. We gave them away for nothing, basically. At the time of the 2005 restructuring, Argentina promised to pay as much as 48 cents on the dollar of the restructured debt through a GDP coupon. And by the time of that restructuring, the market placed nil value on those bonds, something that will eventually and most surely get to 48 cents, more than 20, actually close to 30 billion US dollars, was priced at zero at the time. Not only that, but also the design that we had in our own GDP warrants needs not to be replicated going forward, because every single mistake that was, that you could make around, putting that bond together was actually not missed in the 2005 experience in Argentina. So, let's not just get too carried away with financial innovation unless we're sure that we're hitting the right target. Another lesson from our experience is that holdouts might have more power than what you think, in as much as they were able to succeed in discovery of assets throughout the world, outside the jurisdiction in which they were actually presenting their lawsuits. They were not, and this is a good one, they were not able to succeed in their alter ego initiatives, and the central bank reserves were actually, they were actually protected. But still, it's quite annoying to be a sovereign and to know that any asset anywhere in the world can actually be seized regardless of the jurisdiction. This is something, again, that might need to be taken into account going forward. I also mentioned, as I think this would be my fourth lesson here, that we need to be careful because there can be holdouts of holdouts, and this is something that we are actually going through very meticulously as we speak. There's the issue that the pari passu clause does not necessarily guarantee intercreditor equity, in particular when it comes to the legal framework and the actual claims in the courts. There's the issue, again, that I mentioned before. Even if Argentina lost 2 million jobs by not going through, a good faith negotiation process, it might have been in their best interest for a short-sighted government to actually do that. So we need to take into account the fact that, governments do not always think long run, and this is another lesson that we can take, a bad one actually, from our experience. Governments might get trapped into the prisoner's dilemma and then start, saying all sort of amazing things just for, the local constituency, and very short-sighted about the actual costs going forward. One final point here is that maybe domestic debt is the way forward. You look into the Greek experience, and it's funny how the pari passu clause there was nowhere to be seen. Official creditors got paid. The Greek parliament was able to change the bond clauses, and therefore, in fact, there was no pari passu to speak with. I guess my point here is that when you look into emerging markets and when you look into the G20 agenda, on top of the CACs and so forth, maybe one area where we should spend a lot more time is in deepening domestic capital markets, because there's no experience about holdouts, or at least not such a damaging experience as we've seen elsewhere when it comes to domestic bonds and to domestic markets. And in fact, it would be nicer if emerging market countries spent more efforts at issuing in their own currency and avoiding international courts. With that, I'll stop there, and there are a few minutes left for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Floor is open for questions. Who would like to kick off? I got one in the back there. We have a mic. I think we have. If you could please give your name and your institution as you ask the question.
Yes, hi, good evening. Dino Coast from CLS Bank. Mr. Minister, I have a question for you. So you were there more than a decade ago as central bank governor, and you're very familiar with your case. Now, when you look at the Greek case...
I don't learn, I insist.
So when you look at the Greek case, what lessons learned did the international community draw on that you saw applied in the Greek case, if there were any? Or was it just made up and it was a completely different case from which the Argentine experience did not inform? I'd be very curious about your views on that.
My first thought is that it ain't over until it's over. And I'm not sure that the Greek case is actually over. I think it's completely different from anything you've seen so far because it took the authorities, both Greek authorities and European authorities, so much time that actually, the private creditors had already stepped down and the official creditors had stepped in. There was a massive bailing in procedure before the debt restructuring. Looking at it with retrospective, I wish that had been the case in Argentina because we would not have gone through the hassle that we needed, or maybe we didn't need to, as I said before, but that we actually gone over the last few years. And I myself would have other stuff to spend time on right now rather than fixing this particular issue. I don't think you can use the Greek experience as a pattern for anything else because Greece is a very different example. It's part of the UE. They have a common currency. There were lots of incentives on the official creditors to fix it, regardless of non-meeting the pari passu clause and so forth. The flip side of that, of course, is that they were not able to get enough of a haircut that still puts the Greeks in a different position because when you look at any debt sustainability exercise that you can go through, you actually wonder. But I shouldn't spend time talking about other countries. I'll stick to mine. All I will say about the Greek example is that it's very hard to extrapolate that experience to probably any other country in the world, with the exception of other countries in the European Union.
Thanks, Minister. Another question? Yeah, here near the front.
Thank you, Minister. My name is Carlos Gustavo Cano. I am director of the Central Bank of Colombia, Banco de la República.
Encantado.
Encantado. Felicitaciones.
Muchas gracias.
My question is, I understand that the Central Bank of Argentina is now in a very good hands. But looking forward, have you planned to make the Central Bank independent from the government?
Good question. I think you'll have Federico speaking to the same audience tomorrow. And the bad news is that Federico will be arriving on the same flight I arrived today. So don't expect too much exciting things from Federico. But we, as was mentioned before, I was governor of the central bank myself. I'm very committed to central bank independence. Of course, this is not the important thing. The important thing is that the president himself, Mauricio Macri, is indeed very committed to that. My part of the equation is that usually there are tensions between the finance ministry and the central bank, even if the central bank is truly independent. But I'm very hands-off, and we've got a good coordination keeping the central bank independent. The reason why I go through this long explanation is because when it comes to the jure independence, there's no question that the Central Bank of Argentina is, by its charter, very independent. The problem is de facto independence, as is usually the case in emerging markets in general, and let's assume it in Argentina in particular. The jure is not always the same as de facto, if you see what I mean. Even if that's not enough, one thing we will eventually do throughout Macri's first mandate is to modify the charter of the central bank to make sure that not just the jure but also de facto we give the right signals such that the central bank is independent. The best evidence of the central bank not being independent in Argentina is that since 2007 onwards, or thereabouts, we've been running inflation rates north of 20% per annum, year in, year out. There are not too many countries in the world that can show that record over the last few years. Argentina is one of them, and let's not be mistaken. The only reason why that was the case is because over the last 10 years the central bank was part of the treasury rather than a truly independent central bank.
Our time is up, and I'm sure you have many more questions, but I think we should show mercy to the Minister. You'll do one more question?
There was one question over
Okay.
there. It better be a really good question because we've made this exception for you. Shout your name.
Whitney Debevoise, Marlin Porter. What is your strategy for avoiding holdouts of the holdouts? Or do you just go along until you get 88% of them and then you declare victory and that's it?
Yeah, well, as you've noticed, I haven't claimed victory yet. We are very careful about what we do. We are very convinced about what we're doing. But we are aware that it's a hard balancing act, and that's the reason why we actually came up. If you looked into our case, we came up with two proposals, two offers, which in itself already speaks to non-intercreditor equity. And the two proposals were, in one case we said we're ready to pay. In both cases we said we're going to pay the principal, and this was a massive change with the previous administration, speech-wise, because if you look at the 2005 and the 2010 workouts, there was no haircut to speak of. In fact, those deals are already trading at around 150 on the dollar. So thanks to the GDP coupon, among other things. But precisely because of what you're asking, we said, okay, what we think is fair is the principal plus some reasonable interest. And that reasonable interest we put at 50%, which means around 3% per annum for the period. Some creditors took that offer, particularly the ones who had been very unlucky to be proven right early on. It was almost impossible to push that offer through the rest of the creditors, and this is where we came with a second offer, which is claim minus 30%. So you're happy to take any of those claims, any of those offers. You're not allowed, though, to claim, for instance, if your best choice is claim minus 30%, you're not allowed to complain that someone else got 100 plus 50% and they got a big deal. Because if you do that, I'm happy to flip the offers and have the guy complaining that he's getting claim minus 30% to get principal plus 50%. I guess what I'm saying is that in some cases the principal amount or the original capital is only just 10 cents on the dollar, as I said before. That's the case of the francs. And this is very important, and I'll take this question to, even if this thing is shouting at me, time's up. This was part of our strategy. It was not just good faith, it was also good argumentation and start explaining, not just to the world, but also to the court, what had actually happened. I mean, my experience over the last 3 months or so in different international fora is that people are usually and largely quite surprised when I explain that the claim is not 100%. Because they come up and say, well, Argentina needs to pay, they need to pay 100%. Well, yes, but the claim is 400% for all the reasons that I mentioned before. So yes, there is a risk of holdouts, but that's a minor risk that we need to take. We need to, at least we want to plow ahead. Macri's determination is to put this thing behind. We've made ourselves heard, and we finally were able to make our case, and at least the PR tables have actually turned. All we've done so far is just explain what there is to explain, and that in itself was a sea change. One wonders if the previous administration had done it before, it would have saved certainly us a lot of trouble and a lot of resources. And as I said before, we would have had much more jobs in the system than we have right now. There is that risk. Hopefully, it's a small risk, and it's worth going through it and taking the effort. One final comment there. I think the special master's job, Dan Pollack's role as mediator, is actually fantastic in that he's been extremely objective, and he's been working extremely hard to put the two sort of ends of the table together, and that's finally working. And if it's working, it's to a large extent thanks to his good effort.
Minister, thank you so much. It's really impressive how you can stay on your feet and be so thoughtful and eloquent, and as candid. So,
thank you.
After such a long day,
we can all
keeping
fall asleep
everyone
now.
in their seats.
Thank you very much.